go. Is that
Yeah, that's great, Ross.
operating
Can see
correctly?
that.
Okay. So as Mary said, I did my PhD in Galway and I finished in 2015. And in it, I tried to look at the Chalcolithic, that's the Copper Age in Ireland, and tried to understand it from the perspective of movement and exchange, and basically how people and objects moved around Ireland and from beyond. And to be honest, at the end of 4 years, I ended up with more questions than answers, really, which is quite common. So with that vein, I set up a field school in the Burren. And basically, it was to target the Chalcolithic in a place I thought that there might be some answers. I think those answers are starting to emerge now. But as with every time I've started digging a hole, I found lots of things I didn't bargain on, a whole lot more. In fact, there was a complex multi-period story kind of emerged that also requires considering. So I'm going to try and run through a little of that today, giving you some of the results and trying to talk to you about some of those emerging stories. Our project is, of course, located in the Burren on the southeast of the Burren. It was spread across two hills, Roughan Hill and Knockloon Hill. And if we look at these two hills, it's evident that they're physically very different. Roughan Hill is a solid limestone karst hill with bare rock protruding through rough grazing, whereas Knockloon Hill is a drumlinoid feature covered in soil. This geological difference presented different opportunities and constraints to people in the past and has led to very different archaeology. And also it's affected the survival of the remains, the type of remains that survive on each hill. So in this talk, I will talk about our excavations and what we know about the two hills through time. We will touch on various periods and different stories, starting in the Neolithic, spend a good time considering the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age, and then we'll basically skip through the Iron Age and the early medieval periods, ending up in the post-medieval. It'll be mostly archaeology, but we'll have a little smattering of myth and folklore thrown in as well. So I suppose I have to mention, before I started at Roughan Hill, my PhD supervisor, Carlton Jones, had done decades of research up there, carrying out a very intensive survey and a series of excavations as well. And on the left here, you can see a map of his survey with a number of the features he identified. And we'll have a look at a few of those now in a few moments. But you can see in the purple there, there's some farmsteads. There's a lot of triangles on the map. The triangles are the wedge tombs. And this is the densest distribution of wedge tombs in the country. And very importantly, at the center of it, you'll see a small star. And that's Postmedieval chamber tomb or court tomb that Carlton excavated during his research there. So the court tomb is Neolithic in date. You can see a map of the court tombs in the Burren there. There's a small cluster of 4 along the southeast of the Burren. And interestingly, these are court tombs. Most court tombs are in the northern half of Ireland. But while these are court tombs, they're not morphologically or in shape exactly the same as the court tombs in the north. They lack the typical court. They have a little kind of narrow entrance to them. And all 4 in this cluster and another one over in Tipperary have this kind of characteristic. There is one on the coast of the Burren down by Doolin at Tir Gonane. You can see it there on the map on the coast. And it's more typical. It has a kind of a court on it. So Carlton's excavation is important for several reasons. First of all, it's the only court tomb excavated in this cluster down here in the Burren. But secondly, the preservation of bone was fantastic at Postmedieval court tomb. And that's for several reasons. I suppose the box-like structure protected it, but also the Burren and the limestone tombs on the Burren offer a particular advantage for the survival of bone. The limestone itself is very good at helping to preserve the bone. One of the best possible places you could have bone preserved is in a limestone cave, and the tombs on the Burren are effectively man-made limestone caves. So Postmedieval court tomb held successive set of inhumations. And it's also important for that reason. Most court tombs that have been excavated, say in the north of Ireland, they have maybe a couple of 100 years of inhumations placed in them after they were built around 3,700, 3,600 BC, maybe burials for 100 or 200 years. Parthenobinia, you can see from the dating map there, don't worry about the detail, but it has successive burials over time, right the way through the Neolithic and up to the edge of the Chalcolithic or early Bronze Age, and then a couple of more placed in at a later date too. So we have this continuity there that we don't find elsewhere. So this presents several opportunities. As well as preserving the bones, the conditions in the tombs on the Burren are excellent at preserving ancient DNA. Carlton and I, and Anne Lynch, who recently gave you a lecture on the fascinating remains of Polnabrone, have been collaborating with Lara Cassidy and Dan Bradley at TCD and others on a project looking at ancient DNA in Ireland. And I'm just going to briefly mention some of the highlights relating to the Neolithic in the Burren here. We know that the arrival of farming techniques and technology in Ireland and Britain, so at the beginning of the Neolithic, around 6,000 years ago, came with migrants from somewhere on the continent, with an ultimate origin in Anatolia or modern-day Turkey. Those same aDNA markers have been picked up in the bones on the Burren. However, it's not possible to currently say exactly where the more immediate migration is coming from. However, the majority of the Burren individuals do appear to show more affinity with Spanish early Neolithic groups rather than those from Central Europe, and this may become clearer in future with further samples. Within the Burren, there's also an interesting difference between Polnabrone and Parthenobinia, court tomb DNA, particularly on the Y chromosomes, or male lineages. So it seems that different male lines were associated with the two tombs. It's amazing to be able to pick this out at this stage. And Lara and Dan have also been able to demonstrate that an individual from Parthenobinia court tomb on Roughan Hill, who lived sometime, a good time after the onset of the Neolithic, was the recent descendant of a person with a Mesolithic DNA profile. So from before, a hunter-gatherer person. But this person's forebears seem to have continued living in the Burren and have not interbred with the Neolithic groups over hundreds of years. So this suggests that people continued to live hunter-gatherer lifestyles well into the Neolithic on the coast. So we move on now to the Chalcolithic. What is the Chalcolithic? So basically, when we talk about the Chalcolithic, what we mean is the very onset of metalworking. So chalco means copper and lithic means stone. So for about 300 years, that's 2,500 BC to about 2,200 BC, so 4,500 years ago, up towards 4,000 years ago. People in Ireland were mining copper and using it, but they weren't alloying it with tin yet. So technologically, we're not in the Bronze Age yet. And it's also perhaps culturally specific, this period, or at least there's a few things that arrive at this period that are culturally specific. The most famous of these is probably the Beaker pot, and you can see one here pictured in the center. And in some cases across Europe, that occurs with a specific burial type, which people often refer to as the Beaker package. And this one here from southeast of England, you can see a crouched inhumation buried with a pot and a dagger. Sometimes they're buried with arrowheads as well, and archers' wrist guards. So there's a very specific set of burial goods placed with them. And we find that spreading all across Europe at this time, around 4,500 years ago. The image on the left there is of Ross Island. It's a very important site during this period in Ireland. It's down just outside Killarney. And that seems to be where nearly all the metal for Ireland, and perhaps even Western Britain, was mined during this 300-year period or so. So at the court tomb, we have later early Bronze Age and Beaker burials placed in on top of the Neolithic ones, and possibly some Beaker period objects. And if you remember when I was showing the map of Carlton's survey, he has identified a number of settlements and a lot of walls on the hill as well. And a lot of these seem to date to the Chalcolithic or Bronze Age, early Bronze Age period. And then we have the wedge tombs, which I'll get onto in a moment. So at the habitation enclosures, Carleton identified artifacts typical of the period. So you've arrowheads there, which are hollow based, typically late Neolithic, but also into the early Bronze Age, perhaps. Pottery, scrapers, kind of domestic debris at the farmsteads. He identified at least 4 farms from this period. Very importantly, the pottery that was at these farmsteads or enclosures was largely Beaker in nature. So Beaker pottery was used as domestic ware at these enclosures. And you can see some of it here. And Anna Brinley, the specialist who's looked at this, has dated it to around 2250 BC to 2150 BC. So toward the end of the Chalcolithic or the very start of the early Bronze Age. There was a few sherds of slightly later early Bronze Age pottery as well at the enclosures. So if we look at the combined dates as well from Carleton's excavations, the habitation enclosures, you can see they fall between around 2300 BC and run up to about 1550 BC. So that's basically the span of that starts within the Chalcolithic and that runs to the end of the early Bronze Age. So now we get on to wedge tombs. So what are they? Well, as the name suggests, they're basically wedge shaped. They rise and widen toward the front of them. Wedge tombs are Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age date, which makes them different from all other megalithic tombs. All other megalithic tombs, so like passage tombs, court tombs, portal tombs, are all Neolithic in date. So there's a cessation in the building of those in the Neolithic, and then there's all of a sudden a re-emergence of a megalithic tradition, albeit a different one, building wedge tombs in the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age. So in terms of distribution, they're mostly in the west and north of the country. You can see on the map here, there's lots of them down the peninsular southwest, lots of them in Clare, lots in Sligo and up across into the north of Ireland. In terms of date, collating all the dates from the excavated wedge tombs, Schulting et al. Have shown that the onset of construction is a very Chalcolithic thing. So it's around the time of the Beaker pottery. And Beaker pottery is in fact the most common type of pottery found in wedge tombs, in excavations of wedge tombs. In terms of orientation, they're very consistently orientated. Most earlier Neolithic tombs seem to be orientated on a very wide array, but wedge tombs are consistently orientated, most commonly towards the southwest, but ubiquitously between the southwest and north. You can see these two maps of wedge tomb orientations in the southwest and the northwest of the country. Now, it's been pointed out before by Professor William O'Brien of Cork University and others that the southwest is where Don, the god of death from Irish myth, is supposed to have resided. This is sometimes equated with a general southwesterly direction, and sometimes with specific places such as Chalcolithic or Bull Island here. So from early Irish myths and poems, it seems that Don was considered god of death and an ancestor. And Professor John Carey of Cork University has equated him with a one of a pair of figures from wider Indo-European myth, the divine twins. So if we move on now to our excavations, this is with the field school myself. We've 4 years of excavations, and the first 3 years were spent excavating wedge tombs. So we did this over 3 summer seasons from 2015 to 2017. So we started in 2015 with a small dilapidated tomb. We'll look at that in a second. In 2016, we moved on to a large, very dilapidated tomb. And in 2017, we moved to a medium-sized, relatively well-preserved tomb. And it's one that a lot of you might be familiar with. It's Parknabinia Wedge tomb. It's probably famous, one of the more famous wedge tombs in the Burren, primarily because it's beside the road, and also it's quite a beautiful proportioned tomb. So the 2015 tomb, you can see here in the top right-hand corner, you can see a plan of the excavations. You see a small chamber towards the middle, and a circular cairn surrounding it. Let's see if you can see my cursor here. So there's the circular cairn, and there's the chamber in the center. It was a very small chamber. It was only maybe 2 meters by 1 meter, 2 meters long and 1 meter wide. Before we started the excavation, it only protruded from the grass to about ankle high. It was such a small tomb, it wasn't known about until Carleton survey. Carleton and Paul and some of the other people who were surveying the hill over the years discovered the tomb. In the top photograph there, you can see Daisy, one of the supervisors, excavating in the chamber. So you can see, if you were to lay out of it, it's only the size of a person, really. So inside in the chamber, we found cremations, partial inhumations, and outside the chamber, we found more complete inhumations in the cairn, stuffed up against the outside of the chamber. So there was very few contemporary finds in the chamber, and no pottery whatsoever. We did find artifacts in the excavation, but most of those were scattered around the tomb, out to the front of it. You can see a photograph there at the bottom of the slide of quite a nice flint flake. Seems to have been struck from a large flint nodule, possibly with still some chalk on it. So it might have traveled all the way from the north, perhaps, this flake, the north of Ireland. It's not a stone that you find locally. In terms of dating, dates from this tomb were Chalcolithic. That's from inside the chamber. But the inhumations that were stuffed up against the outside of the chamber were later Bronze Age date. So perhaps what we have here is a small chamber tomb, and then we have a cairn added in one or perhaps more phases during the Bronze Age, sealing the tomb, closing it, sort of changing your ability to access it. So I think the understanding of the tomb probably changed over the Bronze Age. Initially, these were freestanding structures that you could go in and out of, but some of them were then closed off by cairns. So the 2016 tomb that we moved on to was a much larger tomb. If you see in the bottom right-hand corner there, Emily is holding a tape to try and predict the pitch of it, because the back of the tomb had actually sank into a cavernous hole that I'll explain in a moment. But you can see only one side stone was standing. It's about 5 meters in length, and it's over 2 meters high at the front. So a much larger tomb. But if you were to project the other side and put a cap on it, it would have been quite an impressive construction. And all the other elements of that tomb were there, and we were able to find them and record them. We didn't move many out of their position. 1 or 2 we slipped to the side, just so as we could clear the chamber and excavate inside it. But before we started to excavate this tomb, we could see, I suppose, a bump around the front of it. And we thought this might be the edge of a cairn, like the first tomb we excavated. But as we started excavating, we found that most of it was composed of soil, and there was a lot of bone through it. It's actually the bone from the tomb. Badgers had actually moved into the tomb and made the chamber basically the entrance to their set. And they had tossed out all the bone and all the soil out the front of the tomb, or at least the most of it. So we were still able to find the bone, which was one of the primary things we were trying to find here to date and to potentially look at the aDNA from it. But it wasn't in situ. It wasn't in place where it was left. It had all been thrown out of the tomb by the badgers. That's also the reason the back of the tomb had fallen. The badgers had undermined it and it had collapsed. One particularly posh badger seems to have used one of the side stones, a nicely worked either lintel or side stone, as a lintel above his entranceway. So once again, there was very few contemporary finds in the chamber. There was a very finely polished cobble. You can see in the center of the slide there a photo of it with a little scale beside it. That was, we reckon it was deliberately broken. It was smashed very hard with great force. We've also got radiocarbon dates on the cremated bone from here now, and you can see them down below here. They were slightly later in date than the first tomb we dug, but still very firmly in the early Bronze Age, not in the Chalcolithic perhaps, but in the early Bronze Age. Now, perhaps if we were to get more dates, we might get some more early Chalcolithic dates. So then if we move on to the 2017 excavation, this is when we moved on to Parknabinia Wedge tomb. Once again, inside the chamber, we found cremated remains and a lot of inhumed remains this time. At least some of these were semi-articulated, so they were probably interred complete or partially complete. The bodies were put in there with flesh on them. But once again, there was very few contemporary finds in the chamber, and we know it wasn't disturbed the whole way down to the bottom layers inside the tomb. Although there was quite a bit of disturbance, people have been coming in and out of that tomb for a long, long time. Although some of it wasn't disturbed, there was no pottery, no artifacts, none of the typical types of things you would find with Chalcolithic burials. If you imagine the Beaker burial I showed a picture of earlier, that crouched inhumation with the pot and the dagger, etc. So we've had one date thus far that I'm going to talk about, and we're waiting further dates. I'll talk about that at a date. It's a late date, so I'll talk about it when we get to that stage. So what can we tell when we start to bring these three excavations together? Well, first of all, it's really important to note that these are tombs located beside settlements that Carleton excavated at, and the settlements had Beaker pottery. And these are the people who lived at those settlements, almost certainly, or at least some of them are. Yet they weren't buried with Beaker pots. So these are Beaker using people buried without Beaker pots. It's not that they couldn't make them. It's not that they didn't have them. It's not that they weren't using them. They chose not to be buried with them. So what we're looking at here is a choice thing. So it's a variation, a regional variation of culture, but these people are still Beaker using people. In terms of the ADNA, the results from the Neolithic are published, and you can read a number of papers on them, but the ADNA results from the Chalcolithic and the early Bronze Age remains are still preliminary. But I can tell you a few things that Lara and I already presented at a European Association of Archaeologists conference in Barcelona a couple of years ago. So at the beginning of the Chalcolithic, there's another dramatic change in the DNA of the populations in Britain and Ireland. A lot of this new DNA, or a large proportion of it, or at least some signatures, have their origin in the steppe in Eastern Europe and further afield. So we also see that arrival of steppe ancestry in the Burren samples, but it's somewhat more muted than elsewhere. And one Chalcolithic early Bronze Age individual actually showed no steppe ancestry at all. This lack of kind of homogenization or similar amounts of steppe ancestry over time could be evidence that local people stayed actively separate from newcomers, like when we're thinking about the Mesolithic population after the Neolithic people arrived, or we could be observing something different. We could be observing continuous migration from regions that hadn't received this influx of steppe migration. It might still be people moving around Western Europe quite a lot, but just coming from different areas. Particularly if we were to think of Iberia, where it seems a large part of the Beaker package emerged from, but doesn't seem to have this step ancestry until much later in the Bronze Age. So in terms of kinship, we were also able to tell a few things, which is kind of exciting. So the relations between people that we excavated from the tombs. In particular, it was very exciting to find that two young women who were buried in the 2015 tomb, or we only found parts of their remains, but they were sisters. So we were able to identify sisters from almost 4,000 years ago buried in this tomb. Also, I mentioned about the cairns before and these inhumations in the outside. So in some cases, the cairns don't seem to be original to the tombs, and they're wrapping or sealing the tombs in some sort of a closing episode. Another interesting thing we noted was the direction of the eroded karstic surfaces on the tombs. So if you see the arrows pointing inwards there, there's no rock art at these tombs, but when you prise a slab of stone up off the karst on the burren, you have a choice, because one side is nice flat plain, and the other side is quite often covered in cairn or karstic erosion patterns. It's kind of like a natural rock art essentially. And you'll find that the Neolithic tombs, that this tends to be pointing outwards. But on the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age tombs, the Wedge tombs, they've turned that around. It's inverted and they're pointing inwards. So this, we noted this during the excavations and their surveys, and a couple of other people have been discussing it already too. But what might it mean? Well, looking around for anthropological parallels, you don't have to look too far. In modern times in Ireland, people talk about the Fógin Mhaireamh. So this is a form of inversion. And this is basically when you're going walking in the countryside at nighttime or during the daytime. In countryside, well, in a field, well, perhaps. And you stand on a particular sod or the Fógin Mhaireamh, and all of a sudden you can't find your way out of the field. So the way to find your way out of the field is to take your jacket off, turn it inside out and put it on. And that basically, what's happened is you've gotten lost and transitioned into the fairy or the other world. And by turning your jacket inside out, it allows you to transition back again. So what might this mean in the Chalcolithic period when you're dealing with a burial context? Well, basically, it's thinning the veil, perhaps. This active inversion, we believe, is creating a kind of a disjuncture that allows the souls perhaps pass into the next life. So if we go back to look at our two hills again, we've been talking about Roughan Hill only. We'll move over onto Knockloon Hill. And you remember I said the big benefit of digging up on the burren is that you have these tombs made of limestone. So they're great for preserving the bone and for preserving the ADNA. But one of the frustrating things about excavating in that environment is there's not a lot of soil to hold things in place. So everything tends to get moved around. So when you find an artifact, it's very hard to associate it with a body if it had been put with a body, or and things are getting mixed up quite often. So you have to get a lot of radiocarbon dates to try and understand the chronology or what happened over time. But we figured over in Knockloon Hill, things would be set in soil, and we'd have different preservation qualities. Before our investigations on Knockloon, all that was known about was a barrow, so a prehistoric burial monument of a different type to the tombs, up on the center of it, and another circular monument about here. So the first thing we did, this is another thing we could do over on the soil that wouldn't work so well on the karst. First thing we did was geophysics. So Ger Dowling helped us with this, and you can see this wonderful geophysical map from Ger. And this here is the barrow itself, the known about monument. And we found another enclosure here, another enclosure here, and it's quite I suppose, faint, but there is another enclosure here. So this is geophysical survey. It's a way of looking underneath the soil to look to see if there's cut features. And then we found a fairly large blank area up on the highest part of the hill, interestingly. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the new monuments, but suffice to say, we have now on top of Knockloon, this hill that seemed fairly bare, what we can term a ceremonial complex. Now, after the geophysics, we still really had no idea what date it was. We thought perhaps the barrow might be middle or later Bronze Age in date until we started excavating. And you can see here, this is a drone photograph looking down, on top of the excavations. We actually found Chalcolithic or early Bronze Age remains. Now, we found remains of lots of different dates, but this is what I'm going to focus on first. So people were being buried up on this barrow, a monument of a very different type and a very different tradition, at the same time as they were being buried over on Roughan Hill, the neighboring hill, in Wedge tombs. Now, in the Wedge tombs, they seem to have been buried without artifacts, but over on this hill, they were buried with artifacts. So there's something different going on this hill. We found at least 2 cremations that seem to date from this period. I don't have the radiocarbon dates back yet, but we can look at the artifacts that they were buried with. So one cremation over here, and you can see 2 artifacts in with this cremation. One of them is what is either one half of an archer's wrist bracer, which is a typical beaker type of artifact. And the other artifact there is a small whetstone of a very similar size. Now, if this perforated object, if it's not one half of one of these archer's wrist bracers, it's a type of an early Bronze Age pendant. It's one of either of those 2 objects. And then over on the other side of the center of the barrow, if you like, we found another cremation, and just above it in the topsoil, and I'm assuming associated with it, a very small barbed and tanged arrowhead. This is another object that's typically put in with burials from the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age. And then if we take a step back and we look for all the kind of beaker dates across the Burren, we can see we have from our wedge tombs from 2015, we have these kind of Chalcolithic early Bronze Age beaker dates. We have a couple of later ones as well, still early Bronze Age. From our 2016 tomb, we have early Bronze Age, not quite Chalcolithic dates. From Partnabinia Court tomb, we also have Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age dates. From Polawak, that's another Neolithic type, a Linkerstown type tomb from up on the Burren. We also have Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age dates. And also now from Polnabrone, we also know there's Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age dates. So basically in all the Neolithic tombs that have been excavated up on the Burren, we find Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age dates. And also there's this huge explosion of wedge tombs being built. So it does seem we have a fairly dense settlement and at least a very rich burial tradition going on at the time. But so far, single crouched inhumations look to be late in the series. There is a bit of a difference emerging between child and adult treatment in terms of inhumation and cremation. And also, there is beaker type grave goods, but they're quite rare. And it's very rare really to get beaker pottery. When it is put into these burials, it's only put in as a sherd, not as a complete pot that might be typical elsewhere. So other remains that we found at Partnabinia include more human remains underneath the cairn. These aren't dated yet. Some of them aren't dated yet. One is that I'm going to talk about now. So we're moving on from the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age now into the Iron Age. So we did find an inhumation. It was very badly preserved just outside the tomb at Parknabinia. Even though it was badly preserved, we could tell it was a crouched individual lying on one side. And you can see here in the photograph the leg bones, the arm bones, and some of the teeth here. And from the distribution of these, we can tell it was a crouched inhumation. And this burial has been dated between the 4th and 2nd century BC. And from preliminary look, the osteoarchaeologist has been able to tell this person was murdered or sacrificed. At least they were killed. There's peri-mortem injury marks on their ribs. So they were stabbed several times. So we're looking here at either a murder or sacrifice or something along those lines. And then this person was buried in a way that's not typical of the time. Most people at this time were cremated, placed in pits or in ring ditches. This person was inhumed at an ancient tomb. There's also medieval finds from Parknabinia. This is a pin, a dress pin, and a sharpening stone for pins. And if we go back over to Knockloon, excuse me, we have more undated cremations, but we can tell that a lot of these are Iron Age date because of the artifacts we're finding with them. Lots of animal bone from feasting. The artifacts include beads, and you can see here very small blue one, a couple of millimeters across. We have a lot of these. These are Iron Age in date. And then this herringbone motif one is probably 6th to 9th century, so medieval. So they're still depositing things here quite late. We even found the remains of bead production. So not only are they burying people in the Iron Age and into the medieval period up on the barrow at Knockloon, but they're also making objects there. So this tie between craft and burial is very important, perhaps. There's beads in the cremations. So here we have probably an Iron Age bead, could be as late as the early medieval, but we now, the specialist has looked at these beads and suggested that they could be as early as Iron Age, and we're awaiting the radiocarbon dates to support this. We found a couple of mystery objects. I'm only going to show one here very quick. We looked at this for a long amount of time, and eventually our experimental archaeologist, Dr. Billy McFlynn, came back with a suggestion, and I think he's right. It's a dapping and doming tool. So that's a metalworking tool. Now, we don't know from what date, but these probably existed from the Bronze Age on. And the layer it was found in had Bronze Age material, but also up as late as Iron Age or perhaps early medieval too. So that's a dapping and doming tool, basically for shaping, raising sheet metal. The latter stages of Knockloon and Roughan Hill. If we move to the medieval period, we have the high medieval and into the later medieval. We have, of course, Lemina Castle, which is very famous, the tower house here built. And then in the 17th century, one of the most famous individuals from the Burren Rua oversees an expansion of the buildings and the surrounding building and the surrounding landscape here. This large 17th century mansion basically is built onto the side of the tower house. And Knockloon Hill is basically the highest point within her deer park. And Roughan Hill is kind of paired with Knockloon Hill as the cattle park. So there's an interesting juxtaposition between the two hills here because of their geological or and perhaps their land uses ends up different. And then if we move into the post-medieval period, the conception of these tombs becomes quite different. Some of them are known as Dermot and Grania's beds and connected with myth. And also some of them are believed to have fairy curses on them. Parknabinia, the tomb we dug in 2017, was not a known supposedly cursed tomb. And some of you might remember Paul Keane, who sadly passed away a number of years ago. But there are recordings of Paul recounting the stories on the internet. You can find him on Voices from the Dawn. talking about the stories from the landscape. And he tells one particularly interesting story about a man who was building beside Park na Binne and taking stone away from it. And everybody warned him not to do it. And this was in the 1800s. And everybody warned him not to do it, warned him again. He kept doing it, and eventually he got an awful pain in his stomach. And it got so bad that he died. But not just that, he came back to life, then he died again, came back to life and died again. This happened 7 times. It was an awful, terrible death. In the tomb, we did find objects of that period. We found clay pipes, smoking pipes, perhaps dropped there by workmen. We found an iron splitting wedge inside of the chamber. And while I can't connect these things for definite, I like to imagine that after this gentleman perhaps passed away because of disturbing this tomb, that his family or friends maybe took one of his tools and placed it inside the tomb. So all I've left is my acknowledgements, which seem to have disappeared. But everybody that worked on the excavations, and particularly the landowners, I'd like to thank from the Burren landowners, which I had all listed here, but that has disappeared. So I'm going to finish up there and pass back to Mary and Pranjali and see if there's any questions. Where my acknowledgements have gone.
Hi, Ross, that was amazing. Absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed watching that. I got to see some of my old colleagues in the photographs as well, which is always nice. Pranjali, how are we working the questions this evening?
Yeah, I just wanted to say there was a query there earlier. So people, if they have questions for us, maybe please put them into either the chat button or the Q&A button on your panel, and Mary and I can take turns asking them. So we still have about over 10 or 15 minutes to chat to Ross. So do put in your questions if you have any. But Mary,
I have a question, Ross.
You can start with your own one. Yeah.
I have several questions, but I'll
Okay.
try to just keep it to the one because I want other people to get a chance as well. So what's really fascinating is the 2 different hills having 2 different burial traditions from the same age. Do you think that's anything could possibly be a reflection of the fact that you possibly had 2 different kind of populations living there who didn't intermingle, say the people who were descended from the Mesolithic people and the people who were new to the area, the farmers?
Yeah, that's a huge question. Because it ties in, as you know, to the whole history of theory and archaeology. You know, in the past, we used to connect objects with particular cultures and trace cultures moving across the landscape by the movement of these objects. It goes back to Gordon Childs, and in recent times, archaeological theory has argued against that very vehemently, and has seen that as too simplistic a model. And because it kind of got to the stage where we couldn't see cultural change happening within a culture without outside influence. So there was a backlash against it. Now, with the advent of ADNA, we can now see people moving around, especially a lot of people moving around at these periods of particular cultural change, when there's mass technological change, and it's undeniable now, certainly at the beginning of the Neolithic, that this change is brought about by a movement of people. It also, at least that's a major factor within this cultural change. We need to manage to kind of work that knowledge back into our theoretical models and not throw out everything we've kind of discussed in the last 40 or 50 years. But when we move on to the change from the Neolithic to the Chalcolithic, there is this huge kind of international pottery style, if you like, and things associated with the Beaker one I mentioned. And there's different zones of interaction. One's between Central Europe and maybe Britain and Ireland, and one's up and down the Atlantic facade as well. And there's definitely people moving. And from the ancient DNA, we can see it's quite substantial. There's some papers recently and they were reported in the Daily Mail in Britain, showing like almost waves of marauding people coming from the continent into Britain and wiping out the previous, I suppose, inhabitants. And so that was probably going too far, but there is certainly a lot of movement. And there were different cultures in the past. We can't, just because it became theoretically unfashionable, in part because of what happened in Germany in the 1930s and 40s. That's one of the reasons, because of how it became connected with racism, that it became unfashionable to talk about cultures in prehistory. But there were cultures in prehistory. And we might sometimes find cultures butting up against each other, sometimes exchanging things and sometimes not exchanging things in the past. Now, I don't know that that's what we have between Knockloon and I suppose, and Roughan Hill, but definitely we have different traditions represented on those two hills. Whether it's people from the same community choosing to be buried in different traditions,
yes,
or whether it's two different groups butting up against each other, we don't know. But
I wonder, could it be the same tradition but different kinds of people, rated differently within a group, maybe given different? Yeah, that's probably what you're saying.
That's certainly a possibility, and some people have definitely argued that. Like some people argued that the different Neolithic tombs were just ritual choices. But now we can see that they are also different traditions coming from different parts of Europe, perhaps.
Yeah.
Like we've always known that passage tomb tradition, for example, is a very Western Atlantic one, whereas the court tomb tradition, that kind of square shape, if you like, is more connected to Central European traditions. But how that, once those traditions are around each other, and intermingled, even if we think about today and we all become intermingled and multicultural in an area, it's very easy for people then to go just choosing bits and pieces of the different cultures that perhaps not just as they like, but as they see fit. Yeah. For whatever reason, maybe perhaps because one cultural tradition, even if they perceived it that way, they may not have remembered it that way, but they might choose it because it's connected with a certain amount of status, perhaps.
And with the barrow burials, were they all cremations?
Yeah.
So we can never do DNA testing on those?
No, but we can do isotope analysis. So we can look at perhaps where those people were born, yeah, and where they lived their lives. Yeah. So when you live on, as you will know, but maybe just to some of the other people out there, when you live on a particular geology, that soaks up, you are where you live, unless you're drinking water and eating food from the supermarket. But if you're eating the food from the land you live on and drinking the water, that basically soaks into your bones, that geological signature. And we can look at that, and it becomes fixed in the person's teeth at about the age of about 12, and it continues to turn over in their other bones. So you can look at where they were as a child, where they were as an adult. And that has been done for the bones from the court tomb, and it is planned for the bones from the Wedge tomb and from the barrow.
Very good.
So from the court,
so you wouldn't be able to establish whether the people were related, the ones that were...
not the burnt ones. So DNA starts to unravel at about just under 100 degrees. And if you imagine some of these cremations, they got to, I'm not sure the exact temperature, but 800-900 degrees. So once you, like, when they sequence DNA, what they do is they basically heat it up and put it in a solution, and the strands start to separate and find friends, but they just heat it up so to grow the DNA more, they heat it up to just under 100 degrees. So that's when it starts to unravel. So yeah, that's how it's been explained to me anyway, in layman's
related
terms.
To this, the question that's come in from Brian Richardson: would it be possible to trace descendants using the DNA of the remains found? I presume he means the Knockloon,
in the modern population, in the Burren. Is that
Yes.
maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah. You see, there is a bit of a problem with this. And I know it has been reported from the Burren before, you know, that in the very early days of ancient DNA, looking at ancient DNA, that somebody was very directly related to somebody from archaeological context in the Burren. But if you think about your ancestor tree, the further back you go, the wider it gets. And the further down you go, the wider it gets. Now, you only keep a little bit of that DNA from, you know, you only keep a selection, you know, 2 out of every 4. And it keeps going that way. Like if you go far enough back, we're all basically related. Or if you go far enough forward from an ancient person, where you might not retain some of their DNA, but you could be descended from them. So if you go over that long period of time, you'd be better asking Lara or Dan in Trinity, but unless you trace something like mitochondrial DNA or Y chromosomes, and you can follow them to a certain degree, but you'd have to be lucky. You could have a direct, like there's millions of people could be direct descendants of that person, depending on how many children they had, I suppose. But you might only find that Y chromosome in or mitochondrial DNA. And it's, well, actually, mitochondrial DNA works slightly differently. I think you'd find it in lots of them, but the Y chromosome, at least, you can find in the selection of them. But it's not my area of specialism, so I'll.
Okay, very good. Patricia McKee has a question. Was interested in your phrase secondary manipulation of decomposing bodies, and wonder, would you like to expand?
Okay, so that's where people have interacted with the dead. So if we find, I suppose, one of the things when we dig human remains, we're looking for is articulation. So that's when the knee bone is sitting next to the leg bone is sitting next to the ankle bone. So then we know that part of the body was put in with flesh on it. If we find a full skeleton, we know it was interred intact. And sometimes we find burials that were interred intact, but they've removed parts of them. So they've gone in and interacted with them in some way. And this is quite obvious at some of the tombs. At Pull-na-Brone, there's there's been written about this, but also at Parknabinia Court tomb. It wasn't so obvious at the Wedge tombs, simply because the stuff was quite churned up. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Yeah, that was great.
That actually, I had another question. This is a very basic question. You mentioned inhumations. What does it mean exactly?
Okay, so where a body has been buried, as opposed to so there's different burial rites. You have cremation, of course. Inhumation is where the body's basically inhumed or buried. Oh. We also know in the Chalcolithic that people were mummifying people. We also know that we also believe they might have been excarnating people. So there's a lot of different burial rites going on.
And you know, we were listening to Anne Lynch this time last month, and there's a lot of analysis that has happened to the remains from there, and they've found about diet of the people. Do you think that much knowledge is achievable from the remains found in these tombs?
Yeah, certainly. And that's the reason, like at the field school, we chose to dig in the Burren specifically. It's because of the preservation of the bone. I was probably hoping to find more inhumed bone, so unburnt is what bone. I suppose my shorthand for unburnt, but then cremated bone. A lot of the bone is cremated, and what we can do with the cremated bone is more limited. But there is some unburnt bone too. So yeah, but yeah, definitely, and that's it's hard to draw a line under this research. Like I suppose when Anne dug Pull-na-Brone, none of this technology was or these techniques were available, and over time there's been more and more techniques of analysis have become available, and the Burren is a wonderful laboratory for this. Like obviously we don't want to interfere with too many tombs, but there is a wonderful opportunity to investigate relationships because you get such high quality samples from the burn.
Wow. And any plans to go back excavating, Ross, in
Not,
the burn? I know you're excavating in other places all the time.
yeah, so not until the book is finished.
Yeah, that's a
what I've
good,
done thus far.
it's probably
Because,
a good decision. Otherwise
yeah,
you'll never get it finished.
yeah, exactly. So like people might wonder what stage the research is at and stuff. We still have a few specialist reports to get done, and then the blast of final reports will be coming out. And at that point, I want to publish a book on the Wedge tombs, not really including Knockloon. That'll probably come out just as a journal article. And at that point, so that's probably a few years away yet. So at that point, I'd like to go back digging, but you can't keep excavating and not
publishing,
coming up with the goods. So we are giving talks, and we have given lots of conference talks and publishing bits and papers about the various remains, but to kind of draw a line underneath it and move on to the next project in research terms. In contract terms, I go on excavating elsewhere and stuff, but in research terms, I'm waiting for that to be done.
Well, we'll have to get you back when it's time to launch that book.
Yeah.
Yeah, really look forward to that. Yeah, thank